if the world wasn't against me, everybody would see how amazing I am.
Welcome to the Team LogoFit Roundtable. I'm your host, Laurin Conlon. Each week, we share the evidence-based practices and communication-driven strategies we use with our clients and give you the tools that you need to be successful for life. This week, I'm joined with Rick, our team mental health therapist, and we're doing a two-part series on narcissism. I said that word right this time.
You did.
I feel like I say it wrong like every other time that I say it. So I'm done using the word. You take the lead. You're going to say it. I'm not. But this one is just kind of identifying it more as a personality disorder. And the second part will be about dating somebody who is a narcissist.
Yeah.
Which is super common. Unfortunately, and I've personally worked with many clients who have found themselves in that situation. Afterward, in the middle of it, you're not really sure what's going on, but then afterwards, it's very clear.
Yeah, it's trying to see the forest from the trees, and sometimes when you get...
Is that the phrase?
Yeah, you can't see the forest from the trees,
oh.
So you have to move back, get some perspective. Don't question me, Laurin. First of all, for those of you who listened to the last podcast on parenting, there was a miniature debate about how many different movie titles had Parent Trap, and how many did we discover? Not one, not two, not three, not four, but five. Five separate movies with the title Parent Trap. I'm just saying.
Okay, but how can they do that?
I don't know. That wasn't the debate. It wasn't the debate about how they could do that. The debate was how many, and it was five.
And after we talked about that, I went and looked up the plot of the movie, which I totally fucked up for the story. I knew about the Oreos, of course, because of course I remember about Oreos. But then I remember I was like, there's sisters, and there's like I remembered none of the actual plot, but quick refresher with Wikipedia, and I'm good to go now. And apparently there are 5 movies titled Parent Trap. In case you guys were...
And I didn't look it up. Laurin did. She sent it to me.
If you're at the edge of your seat wondering...
Where she was admitting defeat in the most humble ways.
Anyways, how to be a narcissist. Or how to identify.
How to be one? Whoa.
Yeah, that's what our podcast is.
Totally different podcast. I need my other notes for that.
You're like, that's the manual that I've been reading. Okay, no. How to identify...
Yes.
Narcissistic.
Narcissistic, yes. Personality disorder. All right. So I guess the first part of this that I want to start to talk about is I want to give a general overview of what narcissism is and how narcissism in general, in terms of like personality traits and how it manifests, is actually different from narcissistic personality disorder, which is a diagnosable disorder in our DSM. And I think it's important because to make that distinction, because diagnosing narcissistic personality disorder, like 1 to 5% of the population, you'll only capture that actual diagnosis. And for various reasons, and generally is that narcissists don't go to therapy. And I'll explain why they don't go to therapy, but we end up getting a good sense of how many narcissists are out there based off the amount of people that are coming to therapy because they've been in relationships with narcissists, which is totally and completely common. So I guess let's first start off by kind of defining and giving broad characteristics for what narcissism is. So when a person has a long-standing pattern of these behaviors, and I say long-standing because we want it to be, like we talk about evidence-based practices, right? Well, evidence-based practice means like it's not just a one-off, it isn't something that happened a few times. There's consistency within these patterns in the development and the way they treat people, the way they interact, their perception of life, themselves, etc. So what we begin to see is, and one of the first and most common aspects and most relevant aspects of this personality disorder is understanding that they lack empathy. That's a really big component to this. It does breed in, the lack of empathy breeds into other diagnoses as well, which are awful and dangerous at the same time. But understanding that principle is really kind of fundamental in understanding a narcissist. And again, I'll explain all of this. It'll kind of weave itself together, hopefully to provide a more complete perspective. So we have a lack of empathy. They oftentimes will have a grandiose perception of themselves and their place in the world. They'll oftentimes be very arrogant. There's a strong sense of entitlement. Oftentimes they're incredibly superficial. They have fantasies of grandeur and that they believe people are jealous of them. They're usually only jealous of people who have more wealth or power than they do. They definitely do not regulate their emotions well. They're prone to temper tantrums, very similar to what you see out of children, especially when they don't get their way. They are hypersensitive to criticisms. Anytime you make the slightest attempt to criticize or even offer helpful suggestions, they get immediately defensive, and their responses are usually very exaggerated. So they're hypersensitive to criticism. They constantly seek admiration and praise from people, from the world. Everybody should be like thanking them for being in their presence. They cannot tolerate frustration or disappointment. Oftentimes they'll explode, and they'll have a really extreme response to something that shouldn't provoke them that much. They're dishonest, they're controlling. So if you're listening to that list and you're like,
oh my God, I know.
Like my husband's got like 6, 7, 8 of those qualities, just pay attention for the rest of the podcast. I'm not going to diagnose them. We're not going to try and do that. There are some clinical psychologists out there that have identified upwards of like 30 traits that would qualify for narcissistic personality disorder.
And is it one of those that you have to, like, how many traits does it require to be diagnosed? Or is it more of like a length of time thing, right? Like when you look at like binge eating disorder, right? It's like there's a certain frequency and a certain duration of time before you can be diagnosed, right? It's not just like, oh, I had a binge twice in 6 months. That doesn't qualify as binge eating disorder. But you have it, I think it's at least 3 times for 3 consecutive months, like 3 times a week for 3 consecutive months, something like that.
Sure.
Is that how they diagnose it? Or?
No, most of what they would diagnose is they would start looking for the characteristics within the personality, within how the person is presenting. But again, if you're coming to me because you're seeking therapy, because you're like, oh, I was in a relationship that I'm not sure if it was or it wasn't, you're not the person with narcissism. So I can't diagnose your ex-boyfriend or your ex-husband or your ex-wife with this disorder because I'm literally getting your perception of them. But assuming you're not totally skewed in that, most of the time the DSM, you'll look at it and you'll need 6 or 7 criteria for a complete diagnosis. Again, a more in-depth look at it, you're going to look for more qualities and more characteristics and traits. It's not necessarily a length of time as much as it is a consistent pattern, because some of the things I would look at is be like, okay, throughout the 7, 8, 10, 12 years you were with this person, how relevant were all of these characteristics? And if it's something that's only happened within the last like 2 years that they can really identify, maybe there's other factors that are causing it. Versus like, yeah, no, after about the 2nd or 3rd month I was dating them, I really started to witness these things, but I turned a blind eye to it, ignored the red flags, whatever. And now here I am 5 years later, wondering why. That is definitely more of a consistent pattern that played itself out. You just ignored or didn't notice or couldn't understand what was happening. So traditionally speaking, most people think of narcissism as like one type of category. And when you listen to those lists of characteristics or qualities, it's easy to kind of pinpoint and pick certain things out. But most modern day research will indicate that there's actually 4 different types of narcissism. I think I know which one you're going to really love, because I don't know if you've read that part, but I think you'll appreciate the 4th one.
Is this one that I'm striving to be?
No.
How to be a narcissist?
But like how you feel about social media,
okay.
I think it'll really come across. All right, so let's get into the 4 types. So number 1 is the grandiose type. This is the classic, typical narcissist, like staring at the reflection in the mirror because they think they're so beautiful, and they believe that they're beautiful. They believe that they're special, that the world is there to serve them. They're entitled, they're big, they're pompous, and again, they lack empathy, which basically means a caring for other people, for a concern for others. Why are you laughing?
I thought you said a Karen for other people.
No,
like they're like
Karen.
a Karen. I'm like, what?
A caring.
It's like, that's one way of looking at it. All right.
Okay. So that's type 1, which is the typical kind of what we all perceive it to be. Type 2 is what we call the malignant narcissist. And this is a person who in many ways is very similar to the grandiose, but they also possess the ability to be really mean and do horrible things to people. And these are people who can inflict large amounts of damage. It's not just little things that they do. They aren't just making lies about where they were, what they were doing. Like, these are the pathological cheaters. These are the people who will steal, who will hurt. Like Bernie Madoff is an example of that. For those of you who don't know who Bernie Madoff is, he's widely considered one of the greatest fraud artists to ever live because he created a Ponzi scheme where he stole money from people's retirements and cooked his books to make it look like everybody was making money. It was this big Wall Street scandal years ago, and thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people lost their entire life savings while he and his family were like eating lobsters and like buying $1 million homes in all these different areas. So he's a perfect example of what we would call a malignant narcissist, somebody who felt like he was entitled, didn't care about the cause or the harm that he was causing, and caused significant amounts of it. So he's a perfect example of the malignant narcissist. The third one, and this is one that is a little bit more difficult to see for some people, is what we call the covert narcissist. And this is the one who believes that they're great, but no one else can recognize their brilliance. They can be this oftentimes can sometimes, even by clinical trained therapists, we can mistake the covert narcissist for somebody who's just depressed. A lot of times they'll feel like, we like jujitsu, right? And so it's like, oh, I could have been one of the great jujitsu players of the world, but I always got robbed at my tournaments. Like the refs were always screwing me over. The coaching from the other team, there was always some political agenda. I was never at like the peak, but no one ever really got to recognize my brilliance. And if it wasn't for all these other factors, like everybody would know that I'm the greatest of all time. It's like, that's typical for a covert narcissist. It's kind of like their inability to reflect honestly within themselves. And so what we begin to see is they tend to be very resentful, kind of sullen, angry. They're very mopey. And what you begin to see is there's a real victim mentality in the way that they approach the world. Like the world isn't fair. Like if the world wasn't against me, everybody would see how amazing I am. And again, you can see how that can kind of present as some mild depression, like, oh, this person just got low self-esteem maybe. But as you kind of sit with it for a while, it starts to stick its head out. And have you had any experience with people like that?
Yeah, I'm thinking of people.
Okay, we'll keep their...
What do you want me to like share a list? Like,
okay, no.
This person, this person.
No. We don't need you to.
You looked like you were waiting for me. You were like, okay.
No, I just kind of saw you and I was like, oh, maybe she wants to say something. But no. Okay. Keeping those names secret.
I think everybody, like, there's always going to be situations where you're listening and you're like, oh. And of course, unless you're like really, really close with someone, it's going to be hard because you can see like a baseline, maybe like just traits. And maybe that's not actually like disorder, but sure. There's definitely times I think that everybody listening to this can like relate to somebody that they know in some capacity.
Everybody who's listening right now is in their mind, they're like,
oh yeah,
it's this person or these three people or whatever. Yeah, we all do that. I did have a client ask me one time though, all right, if you're dealing with a covert narcissist, where's the boundary between enabling them and feeding into the pathology versus like a friend who genuinely needs some support? And so the best advice I can give you would be to pay attention to kind of the level of victimization they're presenting with. Right. Now, most people who are fairly well-grounded people will take some level of ownership for the reason that they didn't succeed. I didn't prepare. I wasn't focused enough. I didn't give it enough attention. They're able to own on a certain level their own role in the failure or the shortcoming or whatever it is. Why they didn't make it big, why they never became the greatest in the world. And so that's more or less a person who's not necessarily struggling with narcissism and might just need that boost where it's okay to kind of fluff their ego a little bit and guide them along.
Like beaten down for a while.
Versus the person who's like, the world is against me and no one knows how great I am. And if it wasn't for the world, and all these people and the judges being corrupt and giving me the score that they gave me, like I would have totally won everything. And you hear the victimization between that versus the other person who's like, yeah, all right, maybe I wasn't as good and I couldn't handle that. And if somebody can be like, well, did you prepare as well as you could have? Like, were you strict with your diet? Were you lifting as well as you could have? Or like, were you as prepared for the meeting as you could have been? If you can ask those questions and the person's response to you is no, or they can honestly sit back and look at it, then they're not hypersensitive to criticism. They're reflecting on their own behavior. And generally speaking, like that's not a person who's a covert narcissist. What you will see is when you ask those questions and they'll be like, who are you to question me? Like, you know what I mean? And there again is that sensitivity to criticism. It's the exaggerated response. You'll see the temper start to come out. So That's kind of the covert one. And this is the one that I think you'll appreciate. And this is relatively new, is what we call the communal narcissist. And this is the person who, on their social media accounts, it's really relevant now, because what you'll see is this is the person who's like, off to feed the homeless today, and they're in their Gucci outfit, and they're looking like $10 million. They're like, it's Save Animal Thursday, everybody get together, let's all save the world, and here's me with all these photos of me feeding impoverished children and traveling the world and saving everybody. But they're doing it not because they actually care about the cause, but because they love the praise that's going to come back. They're going to write big checks to donations. They're going to attend galas. They're going to want buildings named after them, or somebody will suggest a building named after them. But it isn't about demonstrating empathy for the actual cause. It's about gaining the attention and the praise and the validation that comes from being this person. And I'm sure you've seen that person. Am I right? Was that right?
For sure, yes.
Okay.
I deeply appreciate this one. It's such I feel like it is such a fine line, right? Because when people are on social media, they are able, if they have any kind of audience, they're able to share something that could positively impact those people, right? Or it could just be like a look at me type thing. So I think a big part of it too is how, if we're talking about through the social media world, which this sounds kind of like it mostly would affect. I think it's just how you word it, how you say it, there's just a way to go about it, right? This weekend this week I was at this event, right? And I learned stuff, it was great, and I want to share something about that, not because I'm some expert now, which is clearly far from that, but it was this really great tactical course called Sheepdog Response, and I can use the platform that I have to share, hey, this is something that's really, really relevant for people. Versus me being oh, not me, because again, I couldn't even do this with a straight face, but somebody, just showing a super cool video, just look what I can do, and there's a difference, right? You can share it as hey, here's this awesome organization, here's what I learned, here's what I think other people could learn from it, bringing awareness, because if I didn't have James, my friend, to tell me about it, I wouldn't have known, right? So that's how you can share, versus just oh, here's all the cool shit that I did this week and it's so awesome, and whatever,
right.
And that's a really small example, but it's still something that's relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the difference
intent is
between you sharing with the intent of saying here's some information and here are some things that are happening in the world that are really cool, I experienced this, take it for what it is, versus you saying, I went to this, look at how great I am, look at how amazing I am. And even that wouldn't necessarily fall under the communal, because you're not you're looking for ways to demonstrate your greatness by giving to other people, right? And it's all designed not to benefit the other person, but because you're looking for the admiration and attention that comes from it.
When I hear this, I just think of virtue signaling, right? The people who post stuff just to virtue signal that they did this, you know what I mean? Or they believe this, or they're behind it, when they're really fucking not.
Right.
You know what I mean? You just shared this because you're gonna get a lot of messages, a lot of positive feedback, oh, that's so, bitch, you don't care.
Right.
You don't. We all know that, and that's fine. And again, there's a way to go about that, to show hey, I don't really know a lot about this, but I'm learning about it and I'm excited and I'm gonna be sharing some stuff about this. Versus just the virtue signaler who's not really doing anything. It's such a fine line, because you're well, then can you not talk about anything, right? Or what do you talk about, or how? I think it's just more how do you talk about it.
Exactly. So those are the 4 different types, and so hopefully that kind of gives you guys a slightly wider perspective of what narcissism is and how it can present. One thing that I do want to make very clear, though, when we're talking about narcissism, is that while there might be 4 different types, they all have one common theme in common, really, which is the lack of empathy. It's the ability for them to still feel entitled. There's always a sense of arrogance that comes along with it, that I'm too good for you, too good for the world. And they can't be bothered with whatever it is that you're bringing to them. It's just that general, I don't care.
And I feel that's deeper than just ego.
Yeah.
It feels different. And maybe that's The lack of empathy is more like borderline like sociopathic, whereas just having a big ego doesn't mean that you're a sociopath.
Well,
right?
I mean, a lack of empathy, again, whether you're a psychopath or sociopath, I mean, traditionally speaking, we would classify them as just antisocial personalities at this point. But yeah, like psychopaths actually can care about certain people. And in fact, they can have empathy in certain areas, like they can care about animals. And at the same time, some psychopaths won't care about animals. And in fact, animal torture is one of the earlier warning signs of, psychopathology. But like, if we were to get into that, like I would bring in like the hair assessment, which is like it's an assessment tool that we use to diagnose people who are truly psychopaths. And it's scary because like there's a much higher percentage of the world that would fall into that category than people would think. And it's scary. Like upwards of like 20-25% of people would fit criteria for psychopathology, which is terrifying.
That is terrifying.
Yeah.
In other news, about that tactical course.
Yeah. So suddenly that course becomes relevant. You want to learn how to shoot? All right, here we go. Defend yourself. You're gonna need to. So earlier in the podcast, I started talking about how there's a difference between narcissistic personality disorder and people with narcissistic traits, or people who are generally narcissists. So let me explain this, and I want to kind of dive into this particular section as to why it's difficult to get an accurate number of how many people are truly afflicted with narcissistic personality disorder. If we looked at some of the criteria that we used earlier to diagnose it, or to frame it, so to speak, not necessarily diagnose it, that grandiose, that entitlement, that arrogance. In order for somebody to be, and you guys have heard, if you've listened to me before on these podcasts, you've heard me say that when it comes to any level of diagnosis, what I want to look at is the clinically significant levels of impairment that a person has encountered. And a person experiencing some type of impairment or distress because of their symptoms, it manifests in a way of pain. Like a person who is depressed, they start to have impairment in the way that their levels of energy, their sleep, their sense of worth, and it filters into their relationships, their work, etc. So there's impairment. So that's the person who comes to me and says, hey, I'm depressed. There's no level of impairment for people with narcissism. They don't see themselves as the problem, so why the fuck am I gonna go talk to somebody about something that is clearly your fault?
Because even if they're not like obviously one of the biggest things would be them not maintaining relationships, but they don't see that it's them, they see that it's other people.
Correct.
So again, they're like, oh no, it wasn't me, it's always, that's one thing, and this is not a trait in the DSM, but correct me if I'm wrong, but the people who I am thinking of on this list that is not going to be shared, that fall into this category, it's always somebody who like, it always ends up going back to them as the problem. Like you always hear the stories about like, oh, this person fucked me over, this person did this to me, this person left, this person did whatever. And you're like, the only like web that we can create from this story is you in the center of it. Like you are the driver of all of these problems, but you feel like everybody else is either out to get you or fucking you over. Like that's, I don't know, like,
I mean, that might be part of a covert, right? Where they're like, the world is against me, and this person, and this person, and this person, and no one understands.
You're like, so the people who always have, like, seem to have an issue, right? Like, something's always happening, like some big things blowing up in their life in some type of, like, relationship type way. And, like, at first you're like, oh man, like, this person's, like, really getting beat down, you know, this is always happening. And then you're like, wait. The only person that seems this is coming back to is you. Like, not all of these people
can be wrong
that wrong all the time.
Right. But that's an indicator that they don't accept responsibility for themselves. It is always, the responsibility is always on somebody else for everything that's bad, and if anything good happens, it's always because I'm the most amazing person in the world, right? And so that's the idea. And so they don't experience any real impairment with it. In fact, most narcissists have an opposite reaction to that, because most narcissists, because they don't have impairment with it, they get promoted. Like, these are the CEOs of the world. These are our political leaders. These are athletes. These are musicians. These are entertainers. These are, like, they are true narcissists. But they don't have any real negative experiences. Like, people are always giving them shit. Like, people are doing things for them. And so there's that sense of entitlement that just grows with it. They get promoted. They are financially sound. they get the girls. They are very successful. They own businesses. They own jets and helicopters. And in their minds, they're killing it. Like, the world is a great place and the world is here to serve me. And that's the idea, the mentality of a narcissist. So they have no impairment. There is no problem. They're not the problem. Clearly, you couldn't keep up with me, or you're not on my level, and this is why it's your fault, and this is that. And so you see these things, it's your problem, not mine. Mm-hmm. And so it's the world's problem. They can rationalize anything around that mentality. And what I want people to understand most about narcissism is that at its fundamental core, narcissism is a defense mechanism for insecurity. The people who are truly narcissists are incredibly insecure about themselves. And so this is a facade, it's a defense mechanism sometimes that gets created or developed within a person, is a better way to say it, as a defense for those things, because they're so insecure about everything else, because the emotional side of them was never developed, that everything is about them and covering up whatever level of insecurity. And it's so thick and so strong that they never break through it themselves, which is why they never come to therapy. Who does come to therapy are the people who have been in relationships with them. It's the sons, the daughters of moms or dads who were narcissists. It's the girlfriend who dated a guy who treated her like total crap, and we'll get into that, what that looks like, how that develops. And like I said, with narcissistic personality disorder, the actual identifiable trait is that's only 1 to maybe 5% of all people who have these traits can actually be diagnosed with it. So our tools, our measurement tools, aren't really that great or sophisticated for even diagnosing it, because, and again, they don't come into therapy. On occasion, you get people who have spent their careers working with them. They will call and they'll be like, look, they possess some level of insight and awareness to say, I know that this is causing some level of distress in other aspects of my life, even if they're not personally feeling it. They're like, I know this is bothering my wife or this. But you can only get small changes from them. You can make them be on time, but you can't make them care. And so the level of growth for most narcissists is very, very, very minimal. And we're going to get into, some of that stuff and how and why it's mostly for men. I'll talk about that right now. Unless do you have anything?
Well, I'm just thinking, so I just finished this book. It's called The Molecule of War. It's really good. Mm-hmm. I'd highly recommend it. And it's all about dopamine. And they talked about all these different things with dopamine. And as I'm listening to that, I'm thinking back to that book, right? And obviously, I would imagine, which we don't have any numbers on it, the people who are probably narcissists are also probably highly dopaminergic. That's another hard word. Mm-hmm. Dopaminergic people, right? Obviously, we can't diagnose that. But when you're saying people who are thriving in these situations, politicians, business owners, mm-hmm. artists, Hollywood, all these people, they're always searching more. They have a lot of dopamine. They always need something. And I'm just thinking to how, oftentimes when people are successful, in certain areas, they obviously mm-hmm. Lack in others. Mm-hmm. But then it's would you be this successful person if they didn't use those traits, right? That's where it's hard to say, okay, if you weren't a narcissist, would you own a jet and 5 businesses? Maybe mm-hmm. not. And right. Then you wouldn't be able to impact all these other people. Now, I'm not saying that they're not hurting other people in their life, but there's 500 employees too, so that's something. So it's very interesting.
That's the trade-off.
Yeah, you'll right. never know the answer to that, but it's always could you get there without that? Because mm-hmm. part of, especially very ruthless industries, you can't have too much empathy because you'll never be able to move forward because you're always worried about mm-hmm. that. So it's some of these traits can be funneled in a positive way, but they can also probably go clearly very sideways.
There are people who have explored that very topic, how do I hone my narcissism mm-hmm. to create this type of stuff? Or how do I start to become more narcissistic so that I can achieve in these other areas of wealth, of fame, of power?
Because I think people hear the word narcissism and they just think oh, I want to look better. And it's that's a component, but it's much deeper than just physical appearance.
And I think some people just confuse it for somebody who's just self-centered.
Yeah.
And it's it's different. A little bit deeper than that. This isn't just...
This isn't somebody who likes nice watches right. and works out. You know what I mean?
Right.
That's different, which there's nothing wrong with that either. Mm-hmm. And maybe that person is a narcissist, but maybe not. So I think this is just a lot deeper than most people think, and it's a fundamental personality trait, so like how they treat everybody in the world.
Yes, it is more prevalent in all these aspects of their life rather than just one specific domain. But why it's more prevalent in men, and again, for those of you who didn't listen to the parenting podcast, go back to it, because this is, I really want parents to understand that narcissists aren't born, they're created. And in men, one of the things I specifically talked about was when we started getting to specific age ranges, like that 14 to 18 age range, when boys traditionally begin to shut down emotionally and there's no more pushing for emotional expression. Men are socialized in ways that really feed into narcissism. For example, we're taught to not talk about our emotions. We're taught to not necessarily value empathy. We aren't taught or how to breed compassion or vulnerability. These aren't seen as values within a male-dominated culture in our society. Instead, they're taught to ignore their feelings. They're taught to toughen up. We're taught to lack empathy. We're taught to not care about people or have compassion for each other. And men are measured more in their achievements. So being a good provider, making money, having a big house, these drives are incredibly superficial, but they define who a man is. Versus women, who are taught opposing values. And oftentimes, part of the reason it's not as prevalent in women is because when a woman starts to demonstrate those things, she gets checked. Whereas the guys get to go unchecked. No one's calling them out for being tough and mean and ruthless. They're just a man's man. But a woman starts doing it and somebody's like, "Yo, bitch, mind your place." Like, what are you doing? You know, and so they're like, "Oh, wait a minute, I was stepping out of line and this isn't characteristic for women." And it's like, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, and I'll fully admit that, but that's the reality behind it. That's why. And so it just kind of, it manifests that way, and I almost feel bad, but like, I'd probably say there's a solid 80 to 20% rule. 80% of narcissists are men, 20% are women. As I was telling you before, women, you guys are catching right up though.
I was gonna say, I definitely think that number will be very different soon.
In years to come, yeah. It's growing. Women are like, this is one where when people want equality, like, be careful what you ask for, because it's coming up, and we're seeing it more and more in women being diagnosed with it or just presenting with it in general.
Yeah, and that, you know, I think that, as always, like, there's certain traits in here that are like positive, or can be used in a positive way.
Sure.
Like, you know, being successful is not a bad thing, but, you know, to the detriment of everything else in your life, that certainly can be. Doesn't matter, like, if you're like who you are, but I do think that there has been this huge push for women to do that. You know what I mean? Like, you don't have to get married, like, you can have kids when you're 45, you know, just freeze your eggs, like, you need to be CEO, you need to go do this. And there's been like this huge shift in that way. And I mean, this could be a whole different podcast and topic and rabbit hole to go down, but yeah, I definitely think that that's catching up.
Yeah.
So we'll update those statistics. But I guess there's not even really statistics, because it's just all like observational things, right? But also, I bet, and maybe this is just, I don't know, there would be less people, because you're saying the way that they define these numbers typically is because other people are coming in, right? That's
how we know.
Estimate. Yeah. I would bet that there's less people coming in, men or women, who are coming in saying, this woman is this narcissist, right? Because, like, I have a feeling that it would be more like written off as like, oh, she's just being assertive now. And there is, you know, women can be,
absolutely.
Women can be too, what's the opposite of assertive?
Aggressive.
Passive.
Or passive.
Women can be too passive, but doesn't mean that you have to go from being like a doormat to being this like ultra aggressive person. But typically people are not as threatened by an aggressive female versus an aggressive male. Not just saying, like, I'm not talking about physically aggressive, I'm talking about like in all these contexts. So I'd be interested if like that number is also skewed because people aren't coming in and saying like, oh, this female in my life is a narcissist, right? Like, right. That could be it too.
It absolutely can be. And so there's a couple other things before we begin to wrap up that I want to talk about. And when it comes to identifying these things, this is also the hard part in making that official diagnosis is there's no diagnostic tool or anything written in our DSM that allows us to diagnose somebody where we can say, or where there's no diagnosis for making somebody else unhappy. And that's what narcissists do, is they're toxic personalities that, especially the person they're in a relationship with, everybody else can identify it, can see it, but because there's a safe level of distance, they don't live with you, live within your home, share an intimate relationship with you, there's a level of protection from it. Like, you all have those people where you're like, I can only be around them for a small period of time before like your skin starts to crawl because you're like, this person makes me ill. And that's usually they're a toxic person, not just that they have a bad personality, but that they're toxic. And so one of the things I want people to understand is there's a phrase that when people deal with personality disorders, particularly narcissism, we call, I don't want to use the word victims, but the people in relationship with them start going through what we call narcissistic abuse. And that is a pattern of psychological neglect and invalidation and dehumanization that causes significant stress or psychological harm to whoever it's being directed at. So when I talk about what's causing clinically significant impairment in your life, and that person is coming to me and that other individual in their life is the only person that's causing that stress, this is what we would call narcissistic abuse. And for a lot of my clients who are struggling with this, when they hear that phrase, when they start to identify some of these qualities, they're like, that makes a lot of sense. Like, I'm almost a victim in this. And we can see reactions to this. Like, the most severe reactions to it can almost mimic PTSD symptoms. And other, like, kind of lesser known or more common would be things like they have incredible amounts of self-doubt, there's a lot of anxiety, they don't feel good about themselves, they worry a lot, they're hopeless. And here's the key one, they always feel helpless. Helpless to change anything. And this hurts them within their lives, and it also starts to filter into other areas, their work, their family relationships, their ability to perform well at school, etc.
Because that person's really controlling?
It's not only, their presence in their life is controlling. There's such a dominant force in them, and everything has to be according to them because you fear the reactions. You're walking on eggshells. You don't know if you're going to be praised and what's going to come from it. And they can be incredibly charming. And when we get into the next podcast, I'm going to show you the ways that they use and manipulate people initially to gain their trust, to bait them in, and how you stay. But what ends up happening is people develop patterns of grief with this. And I want to try and help my clients demonstrate and identify the pattern. So I don't want you to hide from it, right? The idea is like, I know there's, when painful things come into people's lives, the first thing they want to do is push it and get it the hell out of their life. But the idea of it is, if I can teach you to sit with your pain and explore it, you begin to identify it later. And so you'll see these qualities in other people, and it will create an adverse reaction in you where you're like, I don't want to be around that person. And you know, you want to learn to not give narcissists an audience. You don't want to enable their behavior, which is difficult for some people to do. But we're going to get into that in the next podcast.
Yeah, I think this is one thing though with all this stuff is that it's so hard because even in a like long form podcast with like nuance, it's still hard to delineate all of the like maybe not like spectrum, but like there is like a huge spectrum of all of this, right? And there's especially with like the words that we're using, I think that especially now they're really misunderstood. When people hear like the word aggressive, they immediately think it's a bad thing. That doesn't necessarily need to be a bad thing. Like being aggressive is not a negative trait. It can be a negative trait if you combine it with a few other traits, but it's not necessarily negative in and of itself. Or like dominant. Being a dominant person, male or female, isn't a negative trait, but it can be, right, in certain areas. So I think that just so much right now is so, especially, you know, going back to the whole social media thing, because people are like just quick snapshots of everybody. Like that's what we're so consumed with, whether it is social media or a video or even, you know, anything on TV. Like the attention span is so short that people see one thing and then they just pick out, oh, it must be. People
read headlines instead of the article.
Yeah. They read the abstract. They don't read like the whole, you know, the results and the discussion and all of this and the methods. And I think that it just requires understanding like the basis of it, like with this is like a very brief outline, but there's so many layers to it, that just because somebody may or may not display a few of these things doesn't mean that, oh my gosh, like they're this awful narcissist person in my life and all of these things. And or even you, if you might be like, wow, maybe I like having achievements and I like working towards things.
There's something wrong with goals and accomplishments in life.
So there has to be, it's not just about the one thing, it's about all of that taking into consideration and literally affecting every part of that one person's life, not just for 2 months. It's also like a recurring pattern, like you said.
Right.
Yeah, I think there's just so much that needs, like, it's such a hard conversation now because everybody's like, oh, like anybody who's dominant or aggressive or this is the problem in society, and you're like, no, actually it's not.
Aggression isn't the problem. The problem is when there's a lack of empathy that goes with it.
Yes.
Like, here's a perfect example. You brought up our friend James, right? And he's a mutual friend of ours, but like, here's a perfect example of aggression with empathy. Like, James is a good friend. We all train jiu-jitsu together. Like, it was a few weeks ago, James and I, we were training, and something happened where we were in the roll, and he's an aggressive guy, so am I. So like, there's aggression, and we're both trying to catch each other, choke each other, put an armbar on one another. But something happened within the roll where an injury occurred, and I accidentally tweaked James's arm. The difference between aggression with no empathy would be like, well, he's a fucking idiot and he shouldn't have done that, versus like, I was genuinely concerned I just screwed up my friend's shoulder. So like, I care about James, I care about other people. So there's a perfect example of how aggression meets empathy. When you care about other individuals, it's the same thing in a business world. If you're like, oh, I'm trying to get this next promotion, but in order to do it, I have to like sabotage somebody else to do it or backstab somebody else, and I don't care. Well, now your aggression has bled into a space where there's a lack of empathy, and now we can start to look at, well, maybe they felt entitled to that. What other elements are around this particular thing? And so yes, use this podcast as an outline for your life and for some of your relationships, but don't allow it to define it. I would encourage you, if you're struggling with this or you think you're in a narcissistic relationship with somebody, and listen to the next one, because some of the stuff I'm going to tell you, you're not going to like hearing it, but you're going to need to hear it, because it's just really important. I would encourage you to seek help from a professional so you can manage this the best or most effective way that you can, or healthiest way possible.
Yeah, for sure. So, as always, if you found value in the show, please share and subscribe to our YouTube channel. This helps us grow the show and continue our mission to educate more people in the industry. If you are interested in working with Rick, I will put his email below in the show notes. And lastly, be sure to check out our website, teamlocofit.com, for other free resources, or to send us an email. So, thank you for listening, and we will talk to you guys next time.